Hello, and welcome to a topic lecture on the emerging technology/security cooperation topic for policy debate in the year 2022 to 2023. This lecture is going to go over potential topic directions that, depending on how you view certain terms in the resolution, this year could go. Then we'll go over topicality of the rest of the resolution, discuss some of the big-ish or biggest AFs, and then we'll discuss core negative grounds. I want to make it clear that the opinions expressed in this video are my own. I can only speak for myself as a coach. And while I'm going to be talking about a lot of other organizations relevant to policy debate, I do not speak for those organizations. So, the topic that we are debating this year is the United States federal government should substantially increase its security cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in one or more of the following areas: artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cybersecurity. So we will have this topic until next school year. So the first thing we need to discuss is topic directions. And what I mean by that is that there are two large groups of people in our community who seem to be interpreting the topic in very different ways, which will dictate kind of how this resolution turns out, what the strategies are, and even what arguments are relevant at all. So the really important phrase in the resolution that is under disagreement is security cooperation. What does it mean, or what should it mean? And the next is emerging technologies. Even though that phrase does not pop up in the resolution itself, the ABC part of the resolution, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cybersecurity, is focused on emerging technology, and the shorthand version of the topic officially from the NSDA is emerging technologies. But is that the most important or the least important part of this resolution? That all depends on how we view the phrase security cooperation. There are two different topic visions that are currently being used to dictate coaching strategy, it appears. The first one is focused on security cooperation itself, making that the most important phrase in the resolution. That says that security cooperation is a term of art that means only Department of Defense interactions with foreign security establishments meant to promote U.S. interests by building defense relationships, allied defense capabilities, support for multinational operations, and ensuring peacetime host access. So that already feels like a pretty specific definition, but there are only some programs underneath the Department of Defense that are included underneath that as well. So it's very specific. To preview, this version of the topic that focuses on this definition of security cooperation is a lot better for negative generic arguments than it is for affirmative ground. This appears to be the view of the topic being used by the National Debate Coaches Association, which runs the Wiki and the Open Evidence Project, as well as they create a novice packet. And then there is also being used by larger debate camps like Michigan, Gonzaga, who both produce wonderful topic lecture videos that I would encourage you to check out. Those are really good, especially for the background part of the topic, but they are very focused on this version. The other group of people seems to be more focused on the emerging technology part of the resolution. They see security cooperation not as necessarily a term of art, but rather as something where both words can be defined specifically. So in the same way that United States, those two words mean something different when you define them separately, but then they come together to mean something specific, the first group of people would say that it's like United and States. Security and cooperation, when put together, they have a very specific meaning. The second group says that really it's not that specific. Together, they just mean that we need to work with allies towards common defense or safety interests. This version of the topic is much better for affirmative ground than it is negative generics. This seems to be the vision of the topic used by the National Speech and Debate Association, the National Federation of High Schools, as well as Baylor Briefs, and there are many other important places for policy debate that I have not listed on here. I didn't go to the topic selection committee meeting, but I have read the topic paper, so these are just my observations. Now, under the first direction this topic could go, on the security cooperation focused, you're saying that the affirmative plan needs to engage directly with NATO, and it's specifically NATO's security forces, in an ABC emerging tech area through the Department of Defense in one of the following activities. And I got these activities from security cooperation documents from the government, as well as a large study from the RAND Corporation that I linked at the end of this presentation. You can pause and read all 15 of those things. If they seem simple, they kind of are, but when you read the specific definitions, you realize like, wow, this is like a very official, highly scrutinized process that the Department of Defense undergoes. Under the other version of the topic, you're arguing that AFs don't have to go through the Department of Defense because there's no common or universal government definition of security cooperation. The Department of Defense defines its own security cooperation activities in a specific way, but as far as the whole government goes, it doesn't have to be that specific. So you argue that a topical plan needs to promote safety, protection, or defense in alignment with NATO objectives or requests of its members in an ABC emerging tech area. Imagine if you are like a safety operator, either for an amusement park or maybe you're a lifeguard, and you're trying to tell people the rules, and you say like no running, or you say please keep your hands and feet inside the vehicle. Then you might say thank you for your cooperation, as in thank you for cooperating with me on doing what you've been asked. So this version of the topic basically says that we should look at what NATO has asked its member states to do in relation to emerging technology, and then the US should cooperate with NATO by following through on those things in an area specific to security and emerging tech. The reason why I think that this version of the topic is more focused on emerging technology is when you read the topic paper, the phrase security cooperation only pops up 16 times, and it only appears in the definition section of the topic paper, which is where the individuals who thought this should be the policy topic wrote around 87 pages worth of stuff about it, background, potential wordings, definitions, all that stuff. It only pops up in the definition section, not in the argument section, like what we would be talking about underneath the topic. Likewise, the Department of Defense, Defense Department, or DoD only pops up 5, 1, and 14 times. And again, it's not really in terms of arguments of specifically what the Department of Defense should do. Most of it's about definitions. Meanwhile, NATO is used 256 times, emerging 89 times, AI or artificial intelligence 122 times, biotech 127 times, cyber 167 times. So in the topic paper, these parts of the resolution are discussed way more in depth in terms of the potential educational value, argumentative ground, all of that type of stuff. And so I think that their idea was that security cooperation, even if it has a specific definition, is not meant to be the focus of what this topic is. In fact, of the 7 topic wordings that could have been chosen from the paper, only one of them used the United States as the sole actor. All 6 others either said the US and NATO, or just NATO should. And only 3 of the 4 used the phrase security cooperation. The other ones used policy cooperation or just cooperation in general. So the people on the right side, I think, aren't focused on security cooperation as the main idea of the topic. And that is evident by the novice case areas that were proposed by the National Speech and Debate Association and the National Federation of High Schools back in February or March. They sent out a list of 10 potential novice case areas for us to vote on to determine what the limits for novices were going to be. The problem is, pause the video after and read all 10 of these different novice case areas and think, if under the first version of the topic, you have to use the Department of Defense, you have to engage with NATO, but you can't force NATO to do anything, and the Department of Defense has to do one of these 15 activities, how many of these 10 novice case areas seem topical? The truth is, I would argue that maybe one of them appears to be topical, and that's for a couple of reasons. First is that NATO and the Department of Defense do not really have regulatory capabilities. The Department of Defense is part of the executive branch of the US government. It is supposed to enforce the laws, and NATO is an alliance, not a regulatory body, so it doesn't pass laws. NATO encourages its members to follow international humanitarian law. It does not set international humanitarian law. So any act that is seeking to regulate emerging technology doesn't appear to be topical under the first version. Second is non-military. If you have to use the Department of Defense, then that means that security cooperation has to be militarily focused, and a lot of the novice case areas are not necessarily militarily focused or military security. They're more security just against dangers to the US or dangers to NATO in general. And then third of all is domestic action. Security cooperation under the specific definition has to be Department of Defense interactions with the Department of Defense equivalent in other countries or in other organizations. So any action that is just the United States doing something on its own or that doesn't require NATO to do anything else doesn't really seem topical. So again, go back and look at this list, especially the 4 bolded ones, the ones that were chosen. Restricting development of lethal autonomous weapons, that's regulation. It's something that the military doesn't do. Or NATO doesn't do. Ban the use of germline genetic engineering in humans. Again, that would be just regulation, something in general, not necessarily military specific. Substantially increased funding for vaccine research doesn't require NATO to do anything, not necessarily military, and then ban offensive cyber operations is not really building the capacity of other member states to do military stuff. And it's not really it's a regulatory action that the Department of Defense doesn't do. It would be Congress restricts the military from being able to engage it. So the problem is that when we view the topic under the first lens, none of these novice case areas really appear to be topical. And there's other problems for the affirmative under the first version too. First is that you can't fiat NATO. The problem is you are required by the resolution to basically propose something to NATO as a potential interaction with the Department of Defense. But because NATO operates on a consensus basis, it's an alliance of 30 to 32 countries, all of them would have to agree with the plan. So if there's even one reason why they might not agree, then the negative is probably going to win that round. Second is that there are no or very few solvency advocates, which are cards that basically say we should do the resolution or we should do the plan. I have scanned and scanned and scanned and looked for so many things. There is not one card that specifically says the Department of Defense should engage in security cooperation with NATO in an emerging technology area. Not a single card, which means that affirmatives are going to have to Frankenstein different pieces of evidence together to say something that the authors didn't necessarily intend, which opens you up to the third problem, which is vulnerability to counterplans. The affirmative is essentially given new stock issues under this interpretation of the topic, where it's up to you to prove that it should be security cooperation, so it has to be the Department of Defense, it should be with NATO, and it should be in an emerging tech area. So now all the negative has to do is figure out which component of that you don't really have a key warrant for, and then they'll just counterplan away from it. Do it through not the Department of Defense. Do it without NATO. Do it with only a couple members of NATO. Do it with a different organization. Have somebody other than the US propose it to NATO. All of those counterplans will basically, any card that you have, be able to steal them away from you, and you're not going to have a great defense to them. The fourth problem is that emerging technology is largely a future focused problem. We're really worried about the hyperbolic potential of emerging technology becoming a huge issue, right? Like we're worried about the killer robots. We're worried about the massive cyber attack that shuts down the global infrastructure, right? That stuff hasn't really happened. And a lot of the biggest, scariest developments of those technologies that get discussed in the literature don't exist yet, which means that if security cooperation is the Department of Defense helping to strengthen the military of other countries, really plans can topically discuss things the Department of Defense already does, which seriously limits the number of potential affirmatives that would make any sense. And then lastly is that under this, biotech and kind of artificial intelligence become largely irrelevant. The Department of Defense doesn't really do a lot with either of those organizations, or with either of those tech areas, so it would become mostly a cyber topic and mostly an offensive cyber topic. So all of these are issues with the first version of the topic. But what about the second version? Is the second version the solution to all the problems? Not necessarily. So, what would be not topical according to security cooperation under the second version, where we're focused more on the emerging technology, where security cooperation is just let's align with NATO with our policies or take an action that improves our security using one of these three technology areas? Well, it wouldn't be topical if you did stuff that NATO has said not to do or that NATO has no position on. And second, activities that are not defensive, like starting a war, wouldn't be topical. Other than that, it seems like this phrase doesn't really limit the topic, which might be a big problem because it explodes the number of potential affirmative cases. Although some people argue that the limiting portion of the topic is supposed to be NATO and the limiting portion is supposed to be the emerging tech. So, what happens to the negative under the second version of the topic? Are there lots of problems? I would argue yes. First is that there's way more viable affirmatives. Nearly everything you could argue promotes security when it comes to emerging technologies, and that would be topical. You'd have really good solvency cards, really good advantages, and the negative wouldn't have the reliable argument of NATO says no. So there's more affirmatives that you have to be prepared for. The other problem is that there's huge differences between the affirmative cases. What do improving funding for vaccines and banning lethal autonomous weapons have in common? The truth is nothing, especially other than they are emerging technology issues. and there's not really a common objection, which means you're going to have to do way more on-case research for way more AFs. There's very few generic counterplans. None of the stuff that I talked about earlier would really work if the affirmative doesn't have to defend the Department of Defense proposing an action to NATO. There's also not as any easy net benefits because, again, if you don't have to defend the Department of Defense, you don't have to defend the military, you don't have to defend NATO action, then disadvantages based on those things don't really work. And lastly is bidirectionality. The first definition basically says you have to increase the capabilities of other militaries, so the affirmatives are all going to go one way. But on the second version of the topic, NATO is pretty vague on what it asks its member states to do. So you could, under the second version of the topic, build lethal autonomous weapons or ban lethal autonomous weapons. And you, as the negative, will have to be ready to answer both of those things, which is pretty difficult. So both of these directions, based on the wording of the resolution, appear to have a lot of problems, whether you're on the affirmative or on the negative. So what direction is better, and what will this lecture be using? The truth is, which side is better really depends on what side you're on. And unfortunately, I think this year, depending on what side you're on, you're going to have to just be ready to kind of gaslight opponents you've debated before into thinking like, didn't you say the exact opposite of what you're saying now when you were on the opposite side? The answer is yes. When you're neg, you want to do the super security cooperation focused version. When you're AF, you're going to want to do the other version. This lecture, to my best of my ability, is going to try and use both. But if I could go back and have the power to change everything, I would have picked one of the other wordings of the topic, and I would encourage camps to focus more on the second direction because I think that that promotes more like educationally valuable and interesting, because I'm more interested in like emerging technology potential than I am in like the inner workings of Department of Defense. And I think most high school students will be too. So the important thing to know is you need to know how to justify your vision of the topic. You need to know how to explain to judges, to teammates, to coaches, to opponents why you think your version of the topic is better. If you say that security cooperation is a term of art, it's DoD only, and it means building military relationships, allied capacity, peacetime access in emerging tech areas, ABC, then you can say that it's way better because as a bright line, it's really easy to tell whether something is or is not security cooperation. You can argue that military education is more valuable to learn about than like hyperbolic tech that doesn't really exist yet. You can argue that nearly everybody agrees on what United States security cooperation is. So there's a literature consensus, and you have that on your side, that it forces affirmatives to be bigger because in order for an affirmative to be valuable, there's going to have to be enough literature on it for them to find all these like checklist of warrants to be counterplans, which means there will also be more negative arguments. So it creates more direct clash over fewer areas. And you argue that generic arguments are good and really important for the negative, that they're key to access policy, that they make it so that you can do policy and not lose your whole life trying to be good at it, that it makes preparation easier, all sorts of stuff. If you're the affirmative, on the other hand, and you want to go the second route, you're going to argue that it's more like security plus cooperation, which means that the affirmative needs to act in line with NATO directives to promote safety or defense in an emerging tech area. You have arguments on your side like framers' intent. If we go with the other version, none of the novice cases are really topical. Educational, like it's more valuable to learn about emerging disruptive technologies than the inner workings of the Department of Defense's interactions with foreign countries. It's way more simple on the second version of the topic. It's way easier to understand for the average lay audience. There's more affirmative creativity, which is crucial to people being interested in doing debate, making rounds less repetitive. Breadth is good rather than depth. And then you also argue that topic generics are bad, that it means that you don't really get your affirmative case engaged with, people do less research, they do less prep, which is one of the best parts of debate. So no matter what side you choose, I think that you need to be ready to explain your version of the topic and say why it is so much better. And again, the whole idea that the novice case areas aren't really viable, if you read the National Debate Coaches Association's novice packet, they produced 3 affirmatives, not 4, and only one of them is actually directly lined up with the affirmatives novice case area. And it's because they felt like, according to Facebook posts that I've read and comments that I've seen, that they felt like the novice case areas were not relevant to security cooperation rather than security cooperation and their version of it being relevant to emerging technology. So how can the affirmative answer security cooperation equals super specific DoD interactions with specific goals topicality? You need to use the 4 goals that they have set up as basically the intent of your AF and make a we meet argument that's like, even if I don't use the Department of Defense, I'm doing the intent of security cooperation, so I meet the important part of your interpretation. So you can argue that your plan builds defense or security relationships, particularly if NATO is upset at what the US is doing or has asked us to start doing something, and your plan does that, then you meet, you're improving relationships. If it's building self-defense capacity, if you help NATO members protect themselves, or if you help NATO, which you are a part of, protect itself, then the affirmative meets. Third of all is building support for multinational operations. This is the easiest one to meet on. You're like, hey, we are improving NATO operations, which is NATO. You can also say NATO is a multinational operation, although in military jargon, I would argue that's probably not true. But you can say your plan meets. The last one is not as helpful, but it's ensuring access to allied territory. So if the affirmative helps the US military stay or get to host nations or keep communication open, then you would meet. So you can use all of these things under each of the 25 affirmative cases that I'm about to give you to argue that you were topical, but a lot of AFs are just straight up not topical under the first version of the topic. And I think what happened was people focused on the specific definition of security cooperation, realized how hyper specific it was, and then realized how bad it was for the affirmative because of all these generic negative arguments. So now most files on open evidence, the plan doesn't read like a plan. It reads like the resolution, or it reads like the resolution, but it doesn't say all 3 areas. It only says one of the areas. And so the solution has been to make the cases really vague. Then you read the cards, and the cards are like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we cooperated? So the plan is to cooperate. And then in cross-ex, you're going to go up there and be like, what do you mean cooperate? And the AF is going to be like, cooperate. And I think that that leads to really bad debates. So the first version of the topic, by trying to meet it, very few cases can be topical and also good. So I think that you have a fine line to walk depending on what strategy you want to go with. Because I think the topicality argument for the negative is pretty persuasive that it's really tough to meet neg on the second version. But now that we talked about topic directions, let's talk about the other words in the resolution. Remember, the resolution is the United States federal government should substantially increase its security cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in one or more of the following areas: artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cybersecurity. Increase, people might argue, means that you have to have pre-existence. You have to engage NATO on something we're already doing a little bit, because they view increase as multiplication. 0 times anything is still 0. Whereas you can argue that, well, 0 plus 1 is increasing. It's addition, not multiplication. But you could also argue if the US and NATO are currently cooperating on emerging technology and then the affirmative restricts that or bans that, then they are not increasing cooperation, they are decreasing it. With NATO, under the security cooperation focused version of the topic, you would argue that means that the affirmative has to be a proposed interaction from the Department of Defense to NATO. It can't be a unilateral action. Otherwise, it's not with NATO. Whereas on the second version, you say we're cooperating with them by doing what they told us to do. A good T argument is that it has to be all 30 to 32 countries. They can't say let's cooperate with some or not all. And it also means that they're cooperating with just NATO in the plan, not the United Nations, not World Health Organization, not the Quadrilateral Security Alliance, and not the European Union. Artificial intelligence isn't going to be like a super helpful T interpretation because it's such like a broad category of things, but you can argue that AI just means that the tech has to have human level decision capabilities in some ways. Biotechnology, people will say that bioscience, or the study of life sciences, is different than biotechnology, which is the application of life science to create a product. So if you only do the science and you don't apply it to create something, then you're not biotech. Some people argue that biotech is different than bioengineering. I don't think either of those are persuasive, but the interpretations are out there. And then I think the idea that it has to be used for product development works just because of literature consensus. If you look up definitions of biotech, every single one of them talks about product creation. It's not really used in like as big of a military context right now. Finally, we have cybersecurity. Some people argue that it must be defensive, that cybersecurity is about protecting yourself. So offensive cyber operations aren't topical, but I would just be like, okay, so if they're not cybersecurity, what are they? And there's not a great answer to that. Some people say that cybersecurity has to be, when it comes to internet connected networks, improving confidentiality, integrity, and availability of those systems. And then lastly is cybersecurity is a broad thing. It's not an individual basis. Like the password on my phone is not cybersecurity. It's supposed to be about government or corporate networks or technology. Now let's talk about affirmatives. So there are three main affirmatives on the topic: artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and cybersecurity. A lot of stuff on open evidence basically says, plan, the USFG should cooperate on artificial intelligence. I'm going to try and give more specific things. Each of these AFs could really be read as an advantage under a different AF or with a more specific or less specific plan text. But biotech is the smallest part of the topic, and cybersecurity is probably the bigger part of the topic. So first on artificial intelligence in general, combining the two directions of the topic, artificial intelligence apps are going to increase research, development, or restrictions on technology that mixes human like intelligence with machines to improve the safety defense capabilities of the United States and NATO allies. First big AF under this is lethal autonomous weapons or laws, which was an LD topic 2 years ago. It's also an NSDA novice case area if you are restricting them, but you could argue that we should ban them, increase research or deployment, or restrict them. These are basically killer robots come to life. They don't super exist yet, but there's arguments that some countries have deployed semi-lethal autonomous weapons. Attempts to ban them preemptively have failed recently, so there's good inherency for it. One of the core controversies surrounds civilian casualties, whether they increase them or decrease them, and whether or not decreasing them would actually be a good or a bad thing. Because if people are like, oh, well, we're not going to kill civilians with these, we're going to kill drones, then maybe it leads to endless war. It also could be good or bad by removing human soldiers, which could be good because there's going to be less dead soldiers, but bad because it means that we're removing humanity from warfare. Lethal autonomous weapons can be classified as in the loop, on the loop, or out of the loop systems when it comes to human involvement. In the loop is maybe the lethal autonomous weapon finds the target, but the human has to press the trigger. On the loop is it can find and shoot the target, but a human can shut it down at any time. And out of the loop is it does it all by itself. And once you kind of set it loose, the human is powerless to stop it. So the restrictions might be on what level of lethal autonomous weapons are acceptable. At the bottom of each of these slides, there's going to be what I think the better answers to security cooperation topicality are, although I think every single one of these asks can use the we're supporting a multinational operation thing. So you can read that yourself. Second is drones. Drones are like the real life, watered down, smaller, less scary, but still pretty bad version of lethal autonomous weapons that currently exist, and we use them now. Particularly the United States and Turkey sell them a lot to other NATO members. So maybe the AF increases sales or transfers of drones to NATO, or you could restrict their development. They're used a lot for surveillance in the Ukrainian conflict because you don't have to worry about like risking human soldiers, and it makes the U.S. a lot of money to sell them. War is very profitable for the United States. You can also require less human soldiers or boots on the ground if you use more drones, which leads to less deaths of soldiers. NATO members are currently also buying drones from adversaries occasionally, or maybe we don't want them to buy them from Turkey as much, so we want to sell them more as the United States. But there's arguments about whether or not the usage of drones is super ethical, so you might want to restrict their development or ban them outright. Next up is general artificial intelligence. You could either ban it, restrict it, or research it. So narrow artificial intelligence is what we have now. Narrow AI is what you've got in your phone, what you have with Google search history, with your Netflix search history. It's what the current artificial intelligence we have is we program algorithms into machines to make decisions that normally would require a human, but we have to program them to do so, and their functionality is very limited. General artificial intelligence would be like we could create a robotic human baby who could then like learn and grow and think and feel in relatively the same way that a human being could. The fear is that these robots, once they were created, would take over or replace human beings, which would be really bad. Or possibly good in some ways. Maybe it's crucial to solve climate change, to create medical innovation, because they'll be able to see problems from a perspective that we don't have. But it also might mean that we can eliminate degrading or forms of labor that humans don't want to enjoy, which might be good or bad either way. because we could just get robots to do it instead. Fourth is privacy protection, the idea that maybe the United States should adopt the European Union's general data protection regulations or encourage NATO members to do the same. We could ban facial recognition technology or protect data storage that is used for artificial intelligence algorithms. FRT, or facial recognition technology, is pretty harmful in the status quo. We debated it on the criminal justice topic 2 years ago, where it is, the same stuff that you use to unlock your phone is also used for like finding criminals, but also sometimes used for finding victims of like kidnapping or trafficking. And it can be very biased against people of color, against women. And the fear is that facial recognition technology is a privacy violation, so we should restrict artificial intelligence used for that. You could argue that privacy is guaranteed under international humanitarian law, or IHL, so we should adopt those regulations and apply them to artificial intelligence. A really scary version that is talked about a lot in the media, it's kind of hyper sensationalized, is surveillance in China through things like the social credit system. Using artificial intelligence can lead to a surveillance state even more than what we already have. So that could be really scary, and we probably want to prevent that from happening. This also crosses over to the cybersecurity area because artificial intelligence works by incorporating large data sets into the machine's algorithm so it can learn from that data, but that data is very vulnerable to being attacked. And so maybe we need to protect that data. And then, there's plenty of answers to security cooperation T on this one. Next is disinformation. So disinformation, we could use artificial intelligence to find or take down bots that are spreading disinformation. We could also restrict access to allied networks, like trying to shore up networks of people within NATO to prevent disinformation from being spread more using artificial intelligence. So right now, there's a lot of disinformation from Russia over the Ukraine conflict, where they are trying to convince their own citizens as well as citizens outside of Russia, like weaker, smaller nations within NATO, that NATO is the cause of the problem, that Russia's what they're doing in Ukraine is right, and that attempts to defend Ukraine's sovereignty are wrong, and that disinformation is harmful. So we could use artificial intelligence to take down bots that are spreading those messages. There's also plenty of disinformation about vaccines or other medical technology that we might want to use artificial intelligence to police. You could argue that disinformation is an anti-democratic and that it decreases faith in democracy, which is one of the ultimate goals of NATO, is to spread democracy. And there's particularly worrisome situations thanks to disinformation in Latin America and Poland right now that NATO has a security interest in and might want to use AI to stop. Next is adopting ethical rules or principles for artificial intelligence. This is probably going to be one of the biggest AFs on the topic, and yet it doesn't really mean anything because every time I click on a file or every time I find a card, it says we should adopt rules. And then there's another card that says adopting rules would be good. We need rules. Rules would be great. But nobody talks about specifically what rules, what ethical principles. So if you can find we should adopt these ethical standards as a country and encourage NATO to do the same, then that would be great. Some of those might include requiring disclosure or transparency to citizens of when artificial intelligence is used, requiring anti-discrimination or diversity promotion when it comes to the development of artificial intelligence, as well as offering more education of citizens on what AI is and how it can affect them. So a lot of people don't know when artificial intelligence is being used, and that might be like an infringement upon, like their right to know. You could require that AI aligns with the values of NATO or the values of your country, whatever you want those to be. You could create rules for data usage on where they get the data, how much permission they have to ask, how they're allowed to store the data, whether like what constitutes usable data, whether it is like flawed or not. And then there's lots of concerns about artificial intelligence being very biased. And so we want to make sure to avoid that by adopting rules against that. Next is PGMs, or precision guided munitions. You could increase the sale of these to NATO countries, or you could try and engage in arms control efforts. Precision guided munitions are like missiles equipped with artificial intelligence to try and hit targets more effectively. So, right now, the Baltic states, members of NATO, are at risk of Russian attack, especially post Ukraine. So, Precision guided munitions being sent there might deter a Russian attack. They also reduce civilian casualties in theory because you can launch them more targeted away from civilian operations. It's also good for the defense industrial base, or the group of companies that fund, or not fund, but create the tech that runs the world's militaries. Because if we sell more of them, then we'll do more contracts with them and give them more money, which is theoretically good for the economy. And if we don't control them, then they could spill over to non-state actors, and instead of avoiding civilian casualties in the hands of the wrong people or the wrong organizations, these will be used to conduct the most effective attacks against innocent people ever. Next is intellectual property protection. Artificial intelligence is created using, coding. It's a technology. It's an invention, just like everything else. Different applications of it. But when people feel like their developments in artificial intelligence might get stolen and used by people with bigger, more resources than them, then they're less incentivized to innovate. So maybe we should increase intellectual property protection over artificial intelligence, or on the flip side, use artificial intelligence or cybersecurity to better protect intellectual property. And possibly we can clarify artificial intelligence's right. What happens if an AI built program invents something? Does that AI own that intellectual property? Does the person who created the AI that created it own the IP? Or is it just for the good of humanity? The arguments here would be that intellectual property is good for innovation, that it encourages people to build more products, which is important for solving existential threats like climate change, like diseases, things like that. You can also say that we need to protect intellectual property because China is beating us in the emerging tech development race, or they're stealing our intellectual property, and this will help us win that fight. And it will clarify potential issues that come up with AI being able to own its own inventions. Lastly, under the artificial intelligence and kind of the cybersecurity part of the topic, is an app about STEM education. You could increase military scholarships for STEM degrees or for STEM learning within the military. And you could also fund K through 12 STEM classes. The argument here would be that military recruitment in the United States and across countries within NATO can be low at the moment, but we need a strong military more than ever. So, by increasing STEM education opportunities when college is so expensive, we'll get more people to want to join the military, or perhaps it will make our military more effective at combating emerging technology. Education at the high school and elementary school level is also severely underfunded. So, perhaps increasing funding for that would be super helpful. The other argument is that there's not enough people going into the cyber or artificial intelligence workforce right now. So we need to increase STEM education to get people interested in these fields, which will be essential to our security later down the road. And also that our security is hampered by the lack of diversity on gender and racial lines in STEM education. And perhaps by funding or pushing more STEM education, we can eradicate some of those inequities. Second category of AFs is biotechnology. These AFs are going to increase research, development, or restrictions on technology founded on life science that manipulates living cells or organisms to innovate new products or materials to improve the safety or defense capabilities of the US and NATO allies. So first, under this, we have human genetic germline engineering, or HGGE. This is a NSDA novice case area. If you ban it, you could also just increase regulations on it, or you could, on the flip side, increase research into the technology. The biggest military application is the creation of super soldiers. Germline editing, unlike somatic editing, is when you edit the genes of an individual in a way that will also affect their offspring and their offspring and their offspring. So the idea is that we could engineer super soldiers who are bigger, faster, stronger, more resistant to different types of weapons, which could either be really good or really bad. The technology's spread could also increase income inequality because parents will design their children through genetic engineering to be bigger, faster, stronger, and have even more advantages, exacerbating income inequality. It could lead to ableism and homophobia concerns where people will try to use germline editing once it is more developed to eradicate disabled populations as well as queer people if they discovered the genes necessary to do so. If they exist, that is. And lastly, when it comes to human rights, if a lot of human rights law is currently based on like you get your rights on the basis of your genetics, and then we change people's genetics, does that change them enough that they lose their human rights? And is that a big enough concern that it is worth banning the technology outright, or restricting it to only be able to be used for disease eradication? And then next up, we have vaccines, which is also an NSDA novice case area if you're increasing funding for them. So you could increase funding or create a framework for researching them, stockpiling them, and distributing them. Justification for this AF is that COVID was awful. We all experienced that in the debate community in a very specific way for the activity, but it also affected us differently across so many different social lines. And NATO countries were hit particularly hard. We were not prepared for pandemics, and we're still not prepared for future pandemics. And I feel like the monkeypox response is showing that as well. China and Russia, on the other hand, noticed that the US and NATO were dragging their feet, that they hoarded vaccines once they developed them for themselves. And then China and Russia filled a vacuum in all the other countries that couldn't get them on their own to boost their vaccine diplomacy, to build relationships. And NATO does not like that. So by by improving our vaccine preparation, we can counteract damage that was done to partner countries, increasing their relations with China and Russia. This will also help us prepare for future pandemics, which have lots of economic impacts, disease impacts, all sorts of stuff. Then we have biofuels. Biofuels are when you take naturally grown substances, usually things like corn, and then through different biological processes, turn them into fuel. So this AF would increase research or development, or maybe require their usage in technology in the military. The justifications are the Department of Defense is a huge polluter. They use lots of fossil fuels. They do lots of damage through different operations, and perhaps using biofuels in the military will make them less of a polluter, or military industries all over the world less of a polluter. Also, our military and the militaries of European nations are being hurt by the oil or fuel shortage caused by Russian sanctions. And if we want to be able to fully reduce or fully eliminate our dependence on Russian oil and gas, having biofuels instead would be helpful. Climate change was also named a top priority for NATO in the most recent strategic concept released at the end of June of 2022. And this might finally allow us to fight that as well as cut off Russia. Bioterrorism defense. So we could stockpile drugs, regulate research, ban the militarization of biotechnology, or focus on threat detection of when bioterrorist attacks have been engaged in, or just bioattacks in general. Diseases could be engineered in a lab and then later leaked or accidentally or used as an attack on populations, and we are not prepared for that. We are not prepared for bioattacks in general or bioterrorism whatsoever, especially across the smaller members of NATO. There's also an arms race going on to develop biotechnological attacks the fastest, and we want to make sure we do it first, or perhaps that we stop trying to win that so that other countries will also back down. When bio threats happen, early response is crucial. So, developing biotechnological markers of when an attack has been unleashed will help us more in the future. So that's this affirmative case area. Then we have cognitive biotechnology, cognitive being about your brain. So it'd be biotechnology that affects cognitive processes and augments or hurts the brain. We could ban brain computer interfaces, or BCIs. We could ban neuroweapon research, or we could ban or increase soldier enhancement technology from cognitive biotech. Thought privacy is a theoretical huge issue where if we all get Google implanted in our brains, then the government and companies will be able to read our thoughts, which could be really bad. Mental illness is also high and on the rise in veterans, in civilians across the world, and in NATO countries in particular post Ukraine. So the idea is that biotechnology provides novel solutions to mental health issues, that we could increase research on to help in those cases. There could also be physical enhancements that use the brain to speed up processes or to block certain things so that we could make our soldiers safer and perform better. And we could also be worried about the potential for biotechnological enhancements to cause the development of neuroweapons, which would be like bioterrorism, but threats that rather than like affecting most of the body, affect the brain. So we might want to slow down research to prevent that from happening. Then we have biotechnology for the purpose of solving climate change. We could fund research or innovation in biotech to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One way is through rare earth minerals. There are some articles out there about biotechnological processes being able to develop like bugs or microbes to help us mine rare earth minerals easier. We could get our plastics from something naturally grown rather than being so dependent on fossil fuels for plastic sourcing. We could create carbon capture trees that will offset carbon emissions to help us fight climate change. And we could also really change the chemical production, which, even if it isn't always as bad for climate change, is really bad for like water resources. Shout out to last year's topic. Finally, under biotechnology, we have agricultural biotech, which also kind of goes with climate change, but you would be increasing research for disease resistance on how to grow food faster and reduce food waste or make it last longer. Crops are very vulnerable to being taken out by disease, especially because of like single crop farming operations being kind of spread through globalization across the world. So we need to be prepared for diseases that are manufactured or naturally occurring to exacerbate famine. World hunger is on the rise because of the Ukrainian conflict, causing supply chain shortages and blocking your like Russian sanctions are making it so that they can't export or import food as much. Agriculture is also the number one cause of climate change and water pollution. So anything we could do with biotechnology to change agricultural processes to be better for the environment would be good. And then lastly, food waste in Western countries, but especially the United States, is incredibly high. So whatever we could do to make our food last longer, go bad less quickly, or appear to look the same way so Americans will still eat it might be useful. Third and final category of affirmatives is cybersecurity AFs. These AFs loosely will increase research, development, or restrictions on technology that protects internet connected electronic systems, networks, and programs from unauthorized access and attack to improve the safety or defense capabilities of the US and NATO allies. First big area under this would be offensive cyber operations, or OCOs, which is an NSDA novice case area. We could increase capacity for them, information sharing, or just ban them. So, justification: US and NATO are getting cyber attacked a lot, daily, all the time, by so many different actors, a lot of which we're not even aware of. We're just getting cyber attacked out the wazoo. And depending on your position, you will argue that either increasing or banning offensive cyber operations will improve that situation. Adversaries, a lot of the times, use allied networks for their operations. Like a terrorist group will use a network in like Germany or in another NATO member, even though they're not from that country. And so offensive cyber operations allow us to go into our allies' networks and then shut those things down to prevent them from causing damage. Um, or you could argue that the US trying to use allied networks to do that disrupts our relationships. NATO members disagree on offensive cyber operations. Some want to use them a lot, some don't want to use them. So, whatever the US's position is in direction towards NATO might have a big effect on it. And whether you think we should be more offensive or defensively focused affects our deterrence posture. And you will argue that either banning them will decrease attacks or increasing them will decrease attacks. Then we have space satellites. Shout out to the LD space exploration appropriation topic last year in LD. Satellites was a huge part of that because they're essential to all military processes and a lot of other things. We could designate them as critical infrastructure and increase cybersecurity focus towards satellites. And the biggest justification is that they are militarily essential. We use satellites for the internet, for GPS, for missile detection, for communications, everything we use satellites for. And climate change is also really, the solution is dependent on satellites for tracking and building climate models of effects to our planet. They're very, very, very vulnerable to cyber attacks because a lot of the satellites, when we first launched them, we weren't thinking about cybersecurity as much. And China and other countries have been rapidly developing the tech that it takes to cyber attack them. So we want to make sure that we're prepared for that. The other concern is that people are less scared of engaging in war in outer space because there aren't really civilians in outer space. But by designating space as critical infrastructure, we basically say if you attack somebody out in space, that would trigger Article 5 in the same way that launching a missile at our electrical grid would trigger Article 5. So maybe that will prevent space war. By the way, Article 5, if you didn't know, is the clause of the North Atlantic Treaty that basically says if you attack one member, you attacked all of us, so we will all come to that country's defense and attack you back. Next is quantum computing, which I'm not a STEM person, but the shortest explanation I can give is it's like supercomputers on steroids, really, really fast computing. So you could fund their research or development, adopt ethical guidelines for quantum computing, or ban the pursuing of the technology. Encryption is the strategy that we use for cybersecurity to protect data, accounts, things like that. And once quantum computing is fully developed, encryption looks like child's play. It becomes the child's lock on the pantry to keep the kids out. It won't really do anything to stop quantum computing, which is really bad because quantum computing, or without its defense of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, that technology would also basically become obsolete through the development of quantum computing if we're not careful. But on the other hand, quantum computing would allow us to engage in experiments and run numbers so much faster that it could be helpful for research, particularly in the medical field. China is also in the quantum computing lead. So by engaging in more research, perhaps we can catch them or stop them from being the first people to develop the technology. And then we can have that like mutually assured quantum computing disruption like we have with nuclear weapons. Next is building a smart grid or a smart electrical grid in the United States or in any NATO member countries that don't really have one. We could build it or strengthen protections on electrical grids that we already have. The current electrical grid in the United States is horrible for renewable energy. It's outdated, it's crumbling, it's very centralized, and it makes the renewable energy movement less effective because we can't put the energy we garner from it onto the grid as well. And they're also very vulnerable to cyber attacks, which would be horrible because blackouts are really, really, really bad on a civilian level and on a military level. But by building a smart grid, we would also be able to create like job security for people because it would take a lot to build a smart grid. Then we have Article 5 clarity. This is probably the biggest or one of the biggest Fs on the topic is establishing trigger levels for cyber attack response. Right now, NATO is using the policy of strategic ambiguity to say a cyber attack could constitute Article 5 being triggered or not. And on the one hand, the idea is that means people won't test the waters, but in effect, people are testing the waters every single day. Some NATO members that are more vulnerable to a cyber attack, but are not the United States, are getting attacked all the time because Russia is like, the US isn't going to do anything. They're not going to risk New York for a random city in a smaller NATO state. So by clarifying the level at which a cyber attack constitutes a triggering of Article 5, that will stop attacks at least at that level, which would be really destructive if they were to occur. Because infrastructure of NATO countries and the US is very vulnerable to cyber attacks, and infrastructure of power and water is crucial to civilians and military communications. It will also improve NATO cohesion if people feel protected and that people will come to their aid. And maybe this will help set up international norms of what is acceptable and not acceptable in cyberspace. Next, we have cyber defense, which is kind of like the opposite of the offensive cyber operations AF area, where you say instead of focusing on our offensive posture, increasing or decreasing it, we need to improve our defensive posture. We should fund cybersecurity teams, expand public-private partnerships, improve our ability to attribute who's attacking us, because the military, again, very vulnerable to cyber attacks. Focusing too much on offense makes us get attacked more, but defense makes us get attacked less and makes attacks hurt less bad. Perhaps it strengthens the defense industrial base, who is focused on developing cybersecurity defensive technology, and also investing in cyber defense will create jobs in the STEM field. Then we have 5G defense. 5G is just fifth generation. It's a mobile network, and like that's why you hear all the phones talk about we're the fastest 5G network. The problem is those 5G networks, with how new they are very vulnerable to cyber attacks through backdoors or through hacking, and we need our mobile networks to be strong for the economy. For civilian purposes, but also for the military, because if you can't communicate in the military, the likelihood of miscalculation just totally skyrockets. So this AF would say, let's strengthen our cybersecurity of 5G. Then we have cyber information sharing, which is the sharing of information in cyber. It's pretty simple. It's the idea that in order for NATO to work together as an alliance in cyberspace, we need to be on the same page, right? Like we would all want to know if Russia was moving troops into a country. We would all want to be on the same page about what Russia's military capabilities look like if we had surveillance on that. And yet, when we find cyber threats, we're not really as keen to share that. So one type of information sharing is that if you are trying to find a vulnerability in the network of an adversary so you can launch an offensive cyber operation, smaller countries in NATO might find them but don't have the ability to engage those targets, and we want them to share that information with the United States, according to this AF. There's also vulnerabilities in allies networks. Like if we find a vulnerability in the network of a NATO member, we want to tell them and we want them to tell us so that we can patch those up and prevent getting attacked ourselves. This will also improve naming and shaming if we share when we've been cyber attacked and figure out who is cyber attacking us so that we can say, like, this person's cyber attacking us, knock it off, which might decrease the amount that we're getting attacked. And it will improve NATO cohesion because it's like when somebody tells you a secret, so you tell them a secret, and then you're kind of just bound together. That's the hope of this AF. Last but not least is election cybersecurity. Maybe we strengthen ballot counting machines, protect people from election disinformation. Americans don't have faith in U.S. elections at the moment, no matter what party they're in. More conservatives might believe that there was fraud and voting fraud, and more liberal people might believe in disinformation campaigns from foreign adversaries affecting elections. So Americans don't have a lot of faith in the US elections. Smaller NATO states are also vulnerable to disinformation in elections, but specifically to Russian disinformation, anti-Western disinformation, which the United States does not like. So perhaps we could strengthen cybersecurity against disinformation or in protecting our voting machines for electronic voting systems outside of the United States or in the United States. And this is essential for NATO because one of NATO's biggest goals is democracy promotion. So we want to make sure we can continue to do that. Now, you might be thinking that sure is a lot of AFs, and this list is not comprehensive. The important thing to know is that not all of them are topical. They're not all going to beat security cooperation T, and all of them have good on-case answers, generic disadvantage links, and like topics or case-specific disadvantages. So now let's talk about core negative ground. There's a couple of disadvantages that will work either way, no matter what direction the topic goes, and then there's a couple that will only work one or the other. First is NATO focus. This might be called the strategic concept disadvantage, a NATO trade-off disadvantage. General idea is NATO's focused on this now. The plan is going to distract NATO, which prevents NATO from solving that thing they were focused on, which is really bad because of this. That could be climate change, deterring China, or the war in Ukraine. Then we have NATO cohesion. You would argue that NATO is getting along just fine. We're unified, but the plan in emerging technology in general is going to exacerbate divisions so that even if NATO doesn't have to say yes, or if NATO says no, or something like that, that's going to make NATO fight. And those divisions get exploited by countries like Russia and China, which will lead to war, or it means that if war happens, we won't be effective. This can turn case because it will prove that, like, if you say in the AF that NATO is really good, you don't want to destroy NATO. Then we have NATO commitment, which is kind of the opposite of the previous disadvantage. It's the idea that we should not be supporting NATO as much because they're not super important. You would argue that NATO is becoming obsolete. and that the plan is going to reinvigorate U.S. support for NATO, which makes relations with Russia impossible, which makes war inevitable. There's conservative and liberal ways of adjusting this argument. Conservatives say more NATO is obsolete because it's not benefiting the United States. Other countries don't pull our weight. We need to focus on ourselves. Liberals say that it might be obsolete because it engages in things that we don't want to support, that it's no longer necessary, that it makes other countries more aggressive. So there's different ways of reading this argument. The uniqueness isn't great because of the war in Ukraine, but it's a disadvantage that you could combine with a counterplan to decrease support for NATO that would make it competitive. Politics disadvantages, I don't have a lot of faith in this year, but people will always try and read them. Politics disadvantages are going to fundamentally change after the midterms because depending on what happens will change everything. The current politics disad is the midterms, but that really only works for 2 months. And on a foreign policy topic, midterms, the idea that this is a big issue is probably not super smart, especially in congressional elections. The Iran nuclear deal is also currently a politics disadvantage that might be resolved by the time the season actually starts. Build Back Better will either be absolutely unwinnable and nonsensical depending on the outcome of midterms. But if the Republicans gain control of both chambers of Congress, which is likely based on current predictions, that might create new politics scenarios interacting with Biden. But because Biden would probably veto a lot of what Republicans would want to do, and Republicans would not want to do anything to give Biden credibility, politics probably won't be that great this year. But every time I've said that, people have found a way to technically prove me wrong. So I encourage you to try. Then we have some directions-based disadvantages. So if the affirmative is increasing the weaponry or technological capabilities of NATO, it will cause some disadvantages, versus if they restrict those capabilities, that will cause other disadvantages. If you increase capabilities, maybe that trades off with current Department of Defense or the Security Cooperation Agency under the Department of Defense's objectives. Maybe it triggers an arms race where China or Russia or North Korea or Iran try to catch us up as we're improving those tech capabilities. Maybe it reduces our nuclear deterrence credibility, because if we're like, oh, we have lethal autonomous weapons now, guess we don't need like nuclear weapons in these countries to defend them, so we're going to take those back. That might cause certain countries to increase their willingness to escalate to a nuclear level because the U.S. pulled back nukes. Then we have stuff about Turkey appeasement, where Turkey is doing a lot of anti-democratic, bad for human rights actions and kind of just getting away with it. And we appease Turkey and tell them everything you're doing is fine when we continue to give them more weapons and more tech capabilities. The second branch of AFs that might restrict weapons or technology might trigger business confidence disadvantages, where businesses are innovating emerging tech now and investors are excited, but all of a sudden the US regulating emerging tech decks their confidence, so they stop investing, which is bad for the economy. Defense industrial base, or DIB, I hate this disadvantage because it's basically like companies profit off of war, and like you are making it so they can't make money off of stuff that kills people, but it's a disadvantage that gets read, so people will probably use it. The deterrence disadvantage says that using these technologies that you are now restricting would have prevented or scared countries out of attacking us with them, but now they'll have no like reason not to develop them and then use it against us because it'll be an unfair fight. And then you have allied proliferation, where if allies feel like the US is decreasing their commitment by restricting ways to protect NATO, by like restricting emerging technology, maybe it causes allies to build nuclear weapons or other weapons of their own that could be really dangerous. When we talk about counterplans, we're saying what should we do instead? Counterplans are going to depend largely on what direction the topic goes or the AF is going. So agent or actor counterplans, these are particularly good if they defend the Department of Defense or you ask them to defend the Department of Defense. Maybe you say instead we should use Congress because Congress is better at regulating. You could say use the Department of State instead because the DoD is bad for some reason. The Supreme Court, you could say we should do them instead of the executive branch, or you could say that instead of the DoD proposing cooperation with NATO, another country within NATO should propose something instead. Then there's cooperation object or the cooperation partner counterplans, where you change who the goal of the cooperation towards is. Maybe instead it's the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the European Union, or the Quadrilateral Security Alliance, which consists of Australia, Japan, and India, who are usually much better at emerging tech than NATO countries are. So I see that counterplan as being particularly persuasive this year. Then we have plan inclusive counterplans or PICs, which normally are hard to read without being topical because it's usually like we should just do the resolution in a slightly different way. Whereas this time, if the affirmative, in order to be topical, has to defend being Department of Defense, interactions with NATO in an emerging tech area, if you cut out any one of those three things, you're no longer topical, but you're still getting to do most of the plan. So you could say unilateral, do the plan without any NATO involvement whatsoever. Do it bilaterally, or ad hoc committee, do it with only some NATO countries, not all of them, or have NATO do it without the United States. Lastly, we have US centric or NATO skeptic counterplans, which are to kind of, they're more like plan exclusive. They're like do the opposite of the plan. So either decrease commitment to NATO, withdraw from NATO, or if the affirmative is like all gung ho, like NATO says yes, NATO says yes, NATO says yes, and they're like, NATO needs the plan, like they will say yes. You can be like, cool, let's propose the plan on the condition that NATO does their part or that NATO does this other thing. Which might be a powerful counterplan to combine with like a NATO says no argument, because it's either the plan fails or if they would say yes, let's get something out of it. Finally, in terms of negative ground, we go to critiques, which is probably the best generic ground on the topic if you live in a circuit where that's viable with your judge pool. The number one critique this year, I believe, will be security, because the affirmative, by nature of the topic, has to link pretty much. Security theory questions the way that we talk about risk, threats, disasters, and existential impacts. It criticizes scare tactics, fear mongering, and argues that security discussions create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the affirmative is going to use security as the goal of cooperation. They're going to use all these big impacts to say, oh no, we have to do something. They're going to paint non-NATO countries as security threats. There's going to be links the house down every single time that the AF stands up for the most part. So this will probably be a pretty good critique, a solid generic that the neg can use this year. And technically, you could combine this with the Department of State counterplan, because then it's not security cooperation, or combine it with like a different branch and then it's no longer security cooperation. So this could be a net benefit to a counterplan. Capitalism critique, good old Cap K. You argue capitalism is bad and that NATO pretty much exists to protect the economic interests of the United States, to promote globalization, that it was founded on the idea of opposing communism and socialism, and that the affirmative is viewing tech through profit rather than the like potential to benefit the collective of humanity. And then you argue that that's really bad. Cybernetics is a critique that I will not even pretend to understand a lot or to have a lot of expertise on, but my basic rundown version of it is that modern technology is changing the way that we communicate, the ways that we understand each other, the way that we empathize with each other. Everything is becoming automated and less genuine, and the affirmative is contributing to that through both their focus on emerging technology and also through their scholarship, and that destroys like the value of humanity and the value of life. Then we have various critiques based on critical international relations theory, which I won't get into here, but there's lots of great intro to philosophy videos on these on YouTube and lots of great files out there for these. Check your back files. Feminist international relations theory, queer IR theory, racial IR theory. All of these critiques will be very relevant to depending on how the affirmative paints the picture of how international relations works. Fifth area of critique specific to the topic are loosely tied together under this idea of expansionism, that the AF will be an expansion of US interests in a way that might be imperialist, contribute to empire, or the settler colonialism critique might work particularly well, especially with like France. NATO's one of its biggest jobs seems to be like quelching dissent in like former French colonies, which is pretty bad. And then, of course, we have identity-based critiques that will have plenty of ways to be linked into this topic based off of the goals of the affirmative, the methods of the affirmative, the scholarship of the affirmative. I think that critiques about racism, gender, and ability, maybe not ecofeminism as much like feminist international relations theory, like I said, will all be very applicable here. We're now to the end of this lecture. Here are some resources that I believe will be helpful. The first one is a link to resources from the National Federation of High School Activities. They have PowerPoints, topic lectures, introductory readings. The next two are cards that I got that list of things that are programs under the DoD that count as security cooperation that you can read to get more information on to craft your specific plan text or your explanation of the plan in CROSS. And then the last one is the topic paper for this topic itself. It's 87 pages, but it's not as big as you think it is. And reading it will really help you be able to justify your topicality arguments better. So all of these are helpful resources for getting started. Final thoughts on the topic and for the upcoming year. Affirmatives, please, please, please be clear. If you are going to read a plan, read a plan. Like, the resolution is not a plan. If you're going to say, let's cooperate on biotech, what does that mean? Like, how? Like, find cards that specifically say what we're cooperating on. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say, like, in order to be topical, we're going to be really, really, really specific and then be really, really, really vague. Like, pick a lane and get really good at it, because otherwise we're going to have really bad debates. If you're afraid of neg generics being able to take you down, rather than creating a bad debate by having a super vague plan, have a really specific AF under the second view of the topic and then be ready to argue T. Because I think that's more educational than, like, what does your plan do? Cooperate. Negatives, on the other hand, your job is to do actual prep. Please do not plan on just reading the same generics every single round, no matter how big or how obvious or how easily researchable the AF is. All of these emerging technologies, because they're purely based on like hypothetical impacts, for every person saying that it could cause something really bad to happen, there's somebody saying it could cause something really good to happen. Use this opportunity to boost your skills at building specific prep arguments. Borrow from LD and PF on your team if you need to for their help in building more case-specific strategies, or from back files, things like that. And then lastly, both sides, or whatever camp you fall under, whichever vision of the topic you prefer, you need to be ready to defend your vision of the topic beyond buzzwords. Like, really think going in, be ready to explain to teammates, coaches, everyone, why do you think policy debate looks better under this version of the topic? And be ready to explain either version for either side. Because when you are defending yourself against this topicality as the AF, you need to be ready to tell the neg that it's not that bad for them. And as the neg, if you think that the AF should have to defend DoD interactions with specific goals, explain, like, give them a case list, like, explain how it's winnable for them. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this was helpful. If you have any questions, or you'd like the PowerPoint or more resources or anything like that, feel free to email me at smithj3@sd25.us. I'll be sure to link that below as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.